It's Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Palmer, and so I'm glad you're with us today. During this program, we'll be speaking with Lee Baca. He is the Sheriff of Los Angeles County. But first, we start with Kurt Hagman. He's a member of the California State Assembly. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to always be on.
I want to speak with you about bathrooms. I'm surprised I'm speaking with you about this subject, but I was recently at a middle school, and I walked towards a bathroom, and I saw a sign that said, "This is a gender-neutral bathroom." I wasn't really sure what that meant, but what I do know is that California is entering that realm of, is it gender neutrality in bathrooms? It's unclear what to call.
Yeah, and I guess there's I don't know what the proper terminology would be either, but the legislature passed, I was opposed to it, but the legislature passed, the governor signed the law, the bill that says kindergarten through 12th graders can self-declare what sex they are.
Right.
And whatever sex they declare they are, they get to use the bathroom facilities, the shower facilities, the sport team facilities, everything. So if you're a 15-year-old male and you say, I feel like I'm a girl, you can play on the girls' swimming team, track team, use their gym, use their showers, just like any other girl would be.
So it's not even creating a gender-neutral bathroom. It's allowing a human being to select their gender and then use the bathroom or locker facilities of that gender.
Correct. My big problem is you may be protecting the rights of the one, but you're infringing on maybe the privacy of the other people in that facility.
I guess what I'm wondering is this a problem seeking a solution?
You know, no evidence was brought up, the reason for this, during our debates on the floor and the subcommittees. Frankly, I thought that the governor never signed on the law, but he did. And I think it could be because the governor never had kids. Maybe he doesn't feel the same way I do as a father right now, who want to protect his 12-year-old daughter when she goes to school. But it could be. I didn't bring up any evidence. There's like a whole group of kids that have this issue. Practically speaking, I don't know how the school boards deal with this, because as a parent, I will be problems with that happening to my daughter, and as they'll be sued either way.
Right. So if it's not a problem seeking a solution, because we haven't heard what you just described, evidence of concern, is it a solution seeking a problem?
I think it's a solution seeking lawsuits in the future, yes, and I think our school districts would be under attack from both sides. Frankly, it's going to create some people who want to prove their point, either political or otherwise, or maybe make just a dollar to be able to sue the district and say you're not accommodating my child, or by accommodating another child, you're infringing on my child's rights.
We do know that some of your colleagues have pulled papers to file a petition for, would it be initiative?
Yes.
So it would go to the voters.
Correct.
What's your sense about that?
Yeah, I think it's an issue that really stirs a lot of people's emotions, and I've supported the initiative myself, both financially and been advocating for it, and I'm hopeful that gets on the November ballot.
Right, and so we do know that we have, is it Title 129? Where, you know what I'm getting at? Where there needs to be equality, equity between the sexes, and that's a federal law, but this, in your mind, goes a step further.
This gives rights to one, but infringes the rights on many on this, and you can't even practically start a third bathroom and say a gender-neutral bathroom, men's, women's, and gender-neutral, because that is also, by interpretation, infringing on those rights and people use the neutral.
Interesting.
So there is no pragmatic solution here. So
I want to talk about a law that was recently passed. It was a law, no doubt, that had been stirring tremendous passion for the proponents, and it deals with driver's licenses for undocumented. Former colleague Gil Cedillo, that was his mission for, seemed like decades, and it was signed into law.
Correct.
And so now, regardless of documentary status, you can get a driver's license. The driver's license will indicate whether you've proven through documentation, but it is now a legitimate driver's license. What's your sense?
It's similar to the bathroom bill. It's a political bill, not a pragmatic bill. The reason why it was defeated in the past is they wanted equal driver's license that legal residents here in California would get, which would violate the legal law of a True ID Act.
Right, the federal law.
So you couldn't board an airplane or a bus or something like that, or start a bank account with it. So now they switched it and made it, well, we'll put some verbiage on there. And I'm okay regulating and testing people who want to drive on our roads, whether you're a citizen or not of California, a resident, legal resident or not. What I don't like is provisions that most people don't talk about in it. There's two of them. One, it says, as an employer, if I see this driving permit, I cannot, and I'm supposed to, as employer, identify a person and make sure they're legal here to work.
The I-9.
By federal law. If I say I can't take this driver's license because it's not a legal ID,
right?
It's a permit to drive. It's not a legal ID. But I say I can't take this and I need another form of ID. Now I'm discriminating. According to the bill, I'm under discrimination. I can be sued for discrimination.
Huh.
Okay. There's also another provision that you and I in our driver's license, the law enforcement has access to our driver's license records, our residential address. As long as we keep it updated, they have access to all that. They actually have a provision in this bill also that does not allow law enforcement, both federal or state, to have access to the person's residence, because they are afraid that the federal government will come in and get this list and go after them and deport them. So there's no background. Once you get a permit, there's no identification past that whatsoever. And all you need is a rental agreement with a name on it to get a driver's permit now.
So this feels like, and I'm presuming what you're saying is accurate, ripe for amendment. Because I think at a certain level, there may be some consensus on the notion that if we pull people out of the shadows driving-wise, they'll be able to get insurance. And that's really, one of the biggest issues is that, we know that the number of uninsured motorists is quite high. Right. And if they get into a car accident, who pays? We do with our uninsured motorist rates. But what you describe is something that could be of concern. So could you go back and look towards amendment?
I would hope so. That's what was the 4 arguments on the floor were to, that we'll fix these problems later. But you're putting employers in a spot to get sued by state government or get in trouble with the federal government. And the fact that law enforcement can't do its jobs for subpoenas and others, that'd be a problem.
Okay, I want to talk more about law and law enforcement and focus on what we know as prison realignment, the prison overcrowding crisis. I was speaking with one of your colleagues, Brian Mainshine from San Diego, also in the Republican caucus, and he indicated that this is really the issue of 2013. And I feel it, I don't know if the public feels it, but here we are today. The U.S. Supreme Court recently said that they will not hear the appeal. And just to remind our viewers that there's a ruling that the state must contract its state prison population by about 10,000. They got a small reprieve to negotiate with the prison advocates. What's your sense of where we are with prison realignment?
109 was the disaster so far.
But wait, but let's talk about it.
Sure.
I mean, because I've heard people call 109 a disaster.
Correct.
I don't know whether it was a disaster, but what I do know is that Governor Brown had a metaphoric gun put to his head.
Sure.
And so if 109 is a disaster, and I'm going to take you at your word, what should be done? We have to decrease our prison population.
I hate complaining about chemical solutions myself. I actually introduced 4 or 5 bills this year to try to help fix 109, not to repeal it, but to fix and give the sheriffs more tools. Let me quantify the disaster part first. 275,000 inmates released this year. I have at least a list of 12 that were released that killed people, including an LAPD officer that was released from San Bernardino not too long ago, about 3 months ago. Myself, never had a crime incident. I've been hit 5 times the last 6 months of burglary and theft. Really? And 3 burglaries and 2 credit card swipes.
Do we know if it's AB 109?
Crime stats from FBI, it's the first time in California's 20, 30-year history has gone off the charts on the lower offenses, because those who get released. So what happens is the average stay before 109 was 3 months in county jail for people waiting trial, being sentenced. Now you have people in LA County 4.5 years. Okay, so the impacts, for every 1 person you're taking from the state, you're releasing 16 to 25 lower crime people.
I get it.
That is a problem. What I think we need to do is go back to the days where you get indeterminate sentences, figure out the least objectionable people to release. When that state prisoners that are doing 30 years that now reformed after 20, that someone who has day-to-day contact says he is less of a risk to society than the guy I just arrested yesterday for burglary.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so you need to pull out some bodies. I agree.
Right.
You need to get rid of 20,000 bodies in the system somehow. Put them across the state lines. Go with your idea. Put them across into the other countries. Or to find out particular ones to release. But to release the ones you just arrested yesterday or a day before is failing miserably. So I put in bills to have a standardized bail schedule this year, to have post-conviction bonds.
Well, let's see what happens. My guess is that come January, when the court orders that the release occur or not based upon the negotiation, we may know more. When we come back, we'll be speaking with Lee Baca. He is the sheriff of LA County. Get his views on prison realignment. He's Kurt Hagman. I'm Brad Palmer. So we'll be right back on Charter California Edition.
What percentage of the American adult population is transgender? 0.3%, 1.3%, 2.3%, or 3.3%? According to the William Institute of UCLA Law School, Transgender adults make up 0.3% of the population.
Welcome back. It's Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz. Our guest, Lee Baca, Sheriff for Los Angeles County. And so I want to speak with you yet again about the prison overcrowding crisis in California. As you know, the U.S. Supreme Court finally ruled that it will not hear the appeal of the state of the local federal court, which ordered that the prisons in the state be contracted. We do have somewhat of a period. It's beyond December 31st. It's towards the end of January. But at this stage, the state is being required, subject to settlement, to contract its prison population.
Yes, it is, and I think it's unusual from the standpoint of specificity because there's 33 prisons.
Right.
Now, which one of these prisons
Yes.
is the one that doesn't have the right services, the right design, and all of the attendant staffing that is necessary? It's more complicated than just a sweeping
Right.
accusation that the prisons are incompetent, need to be downsized.
At this stage, what we know is that the governor's staff and the litigants for the attorneys are talking about some form of settlement negotiation. Frankly, many would be surprised if they come to a resolution. But what we do know is when January 27th comes, if there is no resolution, something has to happen because the court has said you need to get, when they issue the order, you need to release 9,600 prisoners.
Yes, the 9,600 prisoners means Los Angeles County will get about a third of those prisoners.
Really?
We are already up to the highest level of 109
Right.
parolees in California. So adding another 3,000 more, and they're not going to be the benign type, meaning nonviolent, non-sexual, nonviolent. So we're looking for some challenges, and it's
Right.
going to tax us here locally.
At the same time, throughout this, what we know is the AB 109 period. Have we seen an uptick in crime? Because I have to be honest with you, there seems to be a lot of confusion about whether the fact that we have these prisoners allegedly being released early because of AB 109, because of realignment, whether that is leading to increased crime rates.
Well, we do have a record low crime rate. The LA City is at a lower rate
Right.
than last year. The same thing with the County of Los Angeles. I'm not sure of all the police departments in the county, but we are still at a record low. Does it obviate the fact that certain people coming out of prison, any way you look at it, under regular circumstances or 109 circumstances, will reoffend? The best thing we can look for is local programming that will allow recidivism to go down.
And I know that in LA County, you've been working towards that goal. You have a significant education component in county prisons, or county jails, I should say. I know Senator Steinberg, the pro tem, who fashioned this settlement or attempted settlement, is looking towards more mental health rehabilitation programs. Where are we on that?
Moving forward with it, a lot of programming is being developed within the prison system. At the same time, the local county jail here in Los Angeles has the strongest programming going on in the nation, and we have 7,000 prisoners who are actually in classes learning how to reconstruct their lives, do better things with their family responsibilities, try to get themselves better prepared for jobs.
Okay, I want to shift gears somewhat and talk about what's known as the Trust Act. Recently, Governor Brown signed a bill which indicates that California law enforcement shall not interact with federal immigration officials when someone is brought in for a criminal charge if they're undocumented, unless it's a serious crime. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the Trust Act is catching up with the changes that the federal government has already implemented. Over a year ago, I met with the sheriffs of California, the governor, and the director of ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, John Morton.
Right.
And we revised the level of those detainees that are being booked into the jails that are undocumented, that have committed such minor crimes that it doesn't really require all of the processing that ICE was doing before.
But why shouldn't local law enforcement make a reference to immigration? If someone is here and they're not documented, they shouldn't be here. What's the argument? I mean, I know there is one, but I really would like an articulation.
Well, I think the argument is in many forms. The first form is that the offenses were such that they weren't really causing any harm to anyone.
Right.
It was something that was non-offensive to another human being.
Right.
It wasn't a victim.
Right, victimless.
It could be
Right.
a drunk driving with no incident.
Okay.
It could be something involving an argument with a neighbor and
Drug possession.
somebody ends up trespassing on
Right.
somebody's property. It could be something even as simple as driving without a driver's license,
Right.
which, as you know, California now is going to
That's a whole other issue,
solve
right?
that problem. So all those offenses cause some degree of consternation for law enforcement, because the biggest victims of undocumented, the biggest
I know where you're going.
undocumented victimization is
Right.
occurring by those who are undocumented
Right.
who don't want to report to the
Right.
police the crime.
And that's what I've heard as what criminologists say is the most persuasive argument, which is that without the Trust Act, the undocumented and the documented are so fearful of interacting with law enforcement for fear of a reference to immigration services that they don't. And as a result, we see increased victimization in communities of color, whether or not they're documented or undocumented.
Well, and also the United States is dependent on low-income labor for not only the
Right.
food industry
Right.
and the all the different
Right.
jobs that are
Hospitality.
very difficult. Exactly. And so we have this need for economic purposes
Right.
to have a labor force that's a labor
Right.
force that will start in
So
and do those jobs.
are you feeling copacetic with regard to the Trust Act? Some sheriffs are a little nervous about it, others are cheering.
I'm okay with the Trust Act. I think Los Angeles County has shown that record low crime is our goal. The virtues of whether you're documented or undocumented is a federal responsibility. All we're looking at is to maintain the trust that we need within the law enforcement and local communities, and we just can't pick someone out and say you're undocumented.
And you mentioned trust. And part of your goal as sheriff is to increase trust amongst the various communities. 10 million residents in Los Angeles County, lots of ethnic diversity, religious diversity, racial diversity, and a lot of fear, because many of these folks that may have come from different countries are not used to law enforcement that actually may be friendly to you. And so you have developed advisory councils
Yes.
to build trust. Talk to us about these advisory councils.
33 advisory councils, European American, Asian American, Middle Eastern,
Right.
Ethnic groups beyond the languages. All the languages are
Korean,
spoken.
Jewish, gay and lesbian, South Asian, Russian. I mean, they go on and on and on.
And that is what America is all about. And so the law enforcement world is not just safety from criminal acts, it's also the idea that your existence as a human being culturally should be respected, that you are in America, and even though you may look like you're a foreigner, you're not a foreigner any longer, you are an American.
And what's so interesting is, I hinted at it before, is that experiences in home countries really color the way you perceive law enforcement. So if you are a Korean American, it may be that you feel all right about law enforcement because law enforcement in South Korea tends to be more legit, I guess you could say. But if you've come from a Middle Eastern country, some African nations, there could be a real fear factor there.
There's no doubt that in certain countries, law enforcement is very militaristic.
Right.
It has somewhat of a hard-handed way of dealing with safety. That's not what America is all about. We have a Constitution, we have the Bill of Rights, civil rights, and even human rights. And so we follow procedural justice, constitutional policing, and people who are immigrants need to know that.
So what have you learned? What has been the most interesting thing you've learned from these 33 councils?
The amazing devotion they have to America and to be at the new land where they can pursue the freedom to be creative and do their businesses and be a part of the American dream.
Is there a way for Angelenos that may be wanting to get involved in one of these councils?
Oh, no doubt. If you call my office,
Right.
and
We'll put the number on the
will be
screen.
on the
Right.
screen, we'll engage you with one of these advisory councils. The fun part of it is the diverse
Right.
the great diversity in this county.
course.
And I was just at an Austrian celebration
I
in
love
the
it.
backyard of
Right.
a house that looked like we were in Austria up in Las Crucetas.
I love it.
And it's just fun stuff.
Okay, I like it. His name is Lee Baca. He is the sheriff for Los Angeles County. My name is Brad Palmer. So we'll be right back on Charter California Edition.
In fiscal year 2012, how many individuals were deported from the United States? 336,000, 410,000, 567,000 of 613,000. In fiscal year 2012, Immigration and Customs Enforcement removed 409,849 individuals from the United States.
This is Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz. Our guest, Roberto Pedache. He is a professor at Scripps College in Claremont. He's also the author of this book, which just came out over the summer, Econometrics for Dummies. I think it's written for me because when it comes to economics, some call me a dummy. So what is econometrics?
Well, I think of econometrics as being a toolbox that contains the techniques that allow economists to test theories and quantify economic relationships. And so I tended to use it a lot in my field in labor economics.
Right.
So not being an econometrician, but more of an applied econometrician of sorts in my field of labor economics.
And let's talk about labor economics, because California made news in a very significant way when Governor Brown signed a law to increase the minimum wage in our state. It will ultimately hit $10 an hour. What's your sense of that move? Without giving too much of the punchline away, what's your sense of that move?
I think my sense is that it's mixed. The results can be mixed. I think there are certainly benefits that can result from the higher minimum wage. Some workers will have higher incomes, more purchasing power.
Right.
But there could be also some workers who are harmed by the increase in the minimum wage. My research, for example, has shown that higher skilled workers might benefit, but the lowest skilled workers might be harmed by the increase in the minimum wage.
It seems counterintuitive.
Yes, in some ways, yes, but you have to remember that a large number of lower skilled workers are unemployed workers trying to find maybe that first job or trying to find a job after a long period of unemployment. And for those workers, the higher minimum wage might mean increased obstacles in finding that job, because the higher wage now means that employers will become more diligent in hiring workers to justify that higher labor cost.
Which I hear you, but here's the challenge on the flip side. LA Times recently issued an article which says, report says most fast food workers are on public aid. Fast food workers tend to be minimum wage workers. And so what does this mean? That the minimum wage is not enough to live on. And so who's paying the gap? We are. And so where do we go from here when we know that the minimum wage isn't working, but yet your concern is it could squeeze lower skilled out of the labor force?
Yes, and I wouldn't say that the minimum wage isn't working. What I would say is that we need to be cautious, and that we need to understand that there might be benefits as well as costs to an increase in the minimum wage. And so while the minimum wage increase might help some fast food workers, it would help those workers who currently have fast food jobs and are able to retain those jobs when the minimum wage increases. The problem is that what do you do about those workers who don't currently have jobs? And what if the minimum wage happens to make it more difficult now to obtain a job after there's an increase?
Is your sense that the fact that California is going at this alone, it will be, once the $10 level hits, be the highest minimum wage? Is it going to be a competitive disadvantage for our state, or competitive advantage?
Well, I think some politicians have argued this, that California is already unfriendly to businesses, and that increasing the minimum wage makes it even less friendly to businesses. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think that there are also benefits to employers when the minimum wage goes up. Some studies, for example, have shown that turnover decreases when minimum wage goes up. And that's beneficial for employers because it helps them to retain the talent that they've trained and nurtured. So I don't see it as necessarily being a competitive disadvantage. And we have to remember as well that California isn't the only state that has a minimum wage that is above the federal standard. There's about 14.
Well, it tends to be the bluer states. I mean, if you look at them,
yes.
I mean, the bluer states tend to have these higher minimum wages, and those states also tend to be more affluent. And as a result, it's more expensive to live in these states. So in some ways, our $10 minimum wage, if you took, that into Oklahoma or wherever it may be, it winds up being the same as their minimum wage because of our cost of living.
That's right. And in fact, if you look at minimum wage increases over time, you would actually see that the real value of the minimum wage is no higher today than it was in the mid-1960s.
Or is it lower?
Well, it's been lower. It's getting to a point where it's pretty close.
We're at equilibrium.
Yes, we're pretty close to where it was in the 60s. But what we had up until the 60s were increases in the minimum wage that not only kept up with inflation, but actually kept people, low-skilled workers, a little bit ahead of inflation.
Interesting. But we're not there.
But no, then we had serious declines. We had periods where inflation eroded away the value of the minimum wage, and also two very long periods, one in the 1980s, where the minimum wage stayed pegged at $3.35.
I made that
for a very long period.
I remember that.
And even though inflation wasn't extremely high in the 80s, it was enough to make a significant dent in the purchasing power of the minimum wage.
Were you surprised that this bill was actually signed in the end? I was a bit surprised. I was surprised it passed. I was surprised it was signed. Not that I'm for or against it. I'm neutral, of course. I'm a journalist. But were you a bit surprised?
Yes, in some sense I was. I was actually even more surprised by the margin by which it passed.
Right.
Almost 75 to 25%.
Now, some folks say, as California goes, so goes the nation. And so do you believe that California is setting a trend whereby other states will start to increase their minimum wage, or dare I say, the federal government increases its minimum wage?
Well, that's a difficult crystal ball to look into, but I think that I would say yes. If we look at what has happened historically, California has tended to remain with their minimum wage above the federal, and typically other states have followed with California. You're talking about states like Oregon, Washington, Connecticut,
which are some of those are higher than us right now.
Yes.
But we're going to wind up being higher than them once this goes into full effect.
That's true. There are several states, a handful of states actually, who have minimum wages that are currently above $8, which is our current minimum wage. Ours will increase to $9 initially, and then eventually in 2016 to $10.
Right.
That would make us the highest, but we don't know what the other states are going to do in between. Right.
What about the federal level? On the federal level, do you think the federal minimum wage right now is
$7.25?
And so, what's your sense of that? I mean, that's a big gap between $7.25 and $9 and/or $10.
I think it's a big gap, but as you mentioned before, there's also a big gap in cost of living across the country. And so what happens with the federal minimum wage is that all the states have to abide by that wage, even if they don't have their own state minimum wage.
I see.
So the federal supersedes. The only time the state minimum wage supersedes is when it's above the federal standard.
But do you see any movement, I mean, under this Congress, who knows, but any movement generally towards increasing the when was that set? Do you know, sir? The $7.25? How long has that been in place?
$7.25 was set in 2009, I believe.
Oh, so not that long ago.
No, not too long.
So do you think it's time that we look at the minimum wage federally?
President Obama has mentioned the federal minimum wage, so I think it is on his mind at least.
But the
problem is there have been so many other things that have come up that I don't know if there is that momentum that you speak of to really increase that federal minimum wage. It's been mentioned. But I don't see the momentum building up. So
I must ask you, since you are a labor economist, we know that unemployment has been a bit stubborn in California. We are seeing the trend lines decrease, but we continue to be about 3 points above the national average. What's your crystal ball say about California unemployment?
Well, I think the recovery is slow everywhere, and I don't think California is going to be very different in that regard. And I think the problem is that some of the policymakers have used that high level of unemployment to argue that increasing the minimum wage is not a good idea.
You're right.
The problem with that argument is that there are other states, like I mentioned before, that have a minimum wage that is above the federal that don't have the same unemployment problem that California has. So it's difficult to say that it must be attached to this higher minimum wage.
Okay, his name is Dr. Roberto Pedache. He is a professor of economics at Scripps College, and he is the author of this book, Econometrics for Dummies. My name is Brad Palmer. It's Charter California Edition.